At my father's birthday lunch, my sister stood up and let the entire family thank her for taking care of Dad all year. I sat 3 seats away and said nothing. 3 weeks later, when Dad ended up back in the hospital, a nurse asked my sister a simple question about his care. She looked at me because she didn't know the answer. My name is Emily, I'm 46, and my father, Frank, is 74. My older sister, Caroline, is 50. Dad has always been independent, but over the past year his health became more complicated. Nothing dramatic happened all at once. It was a series of smaller things: new medications, specialist appointments, physical therapy, blood tests, days when he was too tired to drive, and weeks when he needed someone to help him keep track of what the doctors had changed. Because I live 20 minutes away and have a flexible work schedule, I became the person who usually went with him. I didn't call myself his caregiver, I was his daughter. Every Tuesday morning for several months, I drove him to physical therapy before work. I kept a note on my phone with his current medications because the list changed twice. I picked up groceries when he was exhausted. When his cardiologist wanted him to track his weight and blood pressure, I bought him a simple notebook and wrote the instructions on the first page so he wouldn't have to remember everything from the appointment. Caroline lived only 15 minutes farther away than I did, but she was busy. That was always the explanation. She had a demanding job, 2 adult kids, and a husband who traveled. I understood that. I never expected her to divide every appointment exactly in half. What bothered me was that she liked being seen as the involved daughter, without actually being involved very often. If Dad had an appointment, I would text Caroline afterward with a short update. She would respond with a heart emoji or thanks for handling this. Sometimes, a few hours later, she would post a family photo of Dad online with a caption like, "Keeping our favorite guy strong." If relatives asked how Dad was doing, Caroline often answered first. "We're staying on top of everything," she would say. The word "we" slowly started to irritate me. Still, I didn't correct her. I told myself it didn't matter who got credit as long as Dad had what he needed. Then Dad's 74th birthday came around. Caroline organized lunch at a local restaurant. I was actually relieved because I had arranged his last 3 medical appointments and had spent the previous weekend helping him replace a broken kitchen faucet. I was happy to let her handle the birthday. About 15 people came: cousins, an aunt, my brother-in-law, the grandkids, and a few old family friends. Halfway through lunch, Aunt Marie lifted her glass and said, "Frank, you're lucky to have 2 daughters watching out for you." Before Dad could answer, Caroline smiled and said, "It's been a lot this year, but you do what you have to do for your parents." Aunt Marie reached across the table and squeezed Caroline's hand. "You've been wonderful with him," she said. "I know how much work caregiving is." Caroline nodded like someone had finally acknowledged a difficult job. Then my cousin said, "Seriously, Caroline, he's lucky to have you." I looked at Dad. He looked uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything. Neither did I. I could have corrected them. I could have listed the appointments, the pharmacy runs, the late-night calls, the insurance forms, the therapy schedule. But doing that at Dad's birthday would have sounded like I wanted applause. So I smiled, took a sip of water, and let the moment pass. On the drive home, Dad said, "You know I appreciate what you do." I said, "I know." He was quiet for a minute. Then he added, "Caroline likes to feel useful." That sentence bothered me more than I expected. I said, "She can feel useful by being useful." Dad laughed softly, but I wasn't joking. For the next few weeks, nothing changed. I still took him to therapy. Caroline still asked me for updates. Dad still tried not to ask either of us for too much. Then, one Thursday afternoon, I was at work when Dad called and said he felt weak and dizzy. I told him to sit down and asked if he could call his doctor's office. A neighbor was with him, and after speaking with a medical professional, Dad was taken to the hospital for evaluation. I left work and met him there. Caroline arrived about an hour later. Dad was stable, but the hospital wanted to review his medications and home routine before deciding what support he would need when he went home. A nurse came into the room with a computer and asked, "Who has been helping Mr. Reynolds manage his medications and appointments at home?" Caroline answered first. "I have," she said. I looked at her but didn't say anything. The nurse nodded and asked, "Great. Can you confirm the medication changes from his last cardiology visit?" Caroline froze. She looked at Dad. Then she looked at me. "I don't have the list with me," she said. The nurse asked, "Do you know which medication was reduced?" Caroline said, "Emily probably remembers." The nurse turned toward me. I opened the note on my phone and read the current list. I also told her the date of Dad's last appointment and the instructions we had been given about his blood pressure readings. The nurse typed for a moment, then said, "Okay, that matches what we have." Before I tell you what happened when the hospital started planning Dad's discharge, if you've ever been the family member doing the invisible work while someone else received the praise, tell me in the comments whether you would have corrected them earlier. And if you enjoy stories about quiet boundaries finally becoming visible, subscribe to Real Stories of Women. A little later, a hospital case manager came in to talk about Dad's home routine. She wasn't interested in who sounded most involved. She needed to know who actually handled each part of his care so the discharge plan would be safe. She looked at Dad and asked, "Who usually takes you to physical therapy and your follow-up appointments?" Dad glanced at me. "Emily," he said. The case manager asked, "And who keeps track of medication changes and the blood pressure instructions?" Dad said, "Emily does." Caroline shifted in her chair. The case manager turned to her and said, "Caroline, what parts of his care have you usually been handling?" For the first time, there was no family audience to impress and no vague, "we," that could cover the gap. Caroline said, "I've been helping with other things." The case manager asked what those things were because she needed an accurate discharge plan. Caroline couldn't give a clear answer. I didn't enjoy watching her struggle, I really didn't, but I also didn't rescue her. The case manager turned to me and said, "Emily, are you comfortable continuing as the primary support person?" That was the question I had been avoiding for months. My first instinct was to say yes. Dad was sitting right there. I loved him. I knew his routine. Saying yes would have been easier than creating tension. But I realized that if I said yes without changing anything, I would keep doing nearly everything while the family continued pretending the responsibility was shared. So I said, "I can keep helping Dad, but I can't be the only person responsible anymore." Caroline looked at me sharply. I continued, "I work too. I've been covering most of the appointments because it was easier than arguing about it. That doesn't mean it's sustainable." The case manager didn't react emotionally. She simply said, "Then we need a plan that reflects that." She pulled up a calendar and started asking practical questions. Who could handle physical therapy? Who could pick up prescriptions? Who could be available for follow-up appointments? What tasks could Dad still do independently? What outside support was available if the family couldn't cover everything? For once, caregiving stopped being a family performance and became a list of actual responsibilities. Caroline volunteered for Friday appointments and pharmacy pickups. I kept Tuesday therapy for the next month. Dad agreed to use a pill organizer and the written medication list instead of relying on memory. The case manager also gave us information about local support services we could explore if his needs increased. When she left, Caroline said, "You made me look useless." I said, "I didn't make you look like anything." She asked what you do. Caroline said, "You could have backed me up." I asked, "Backed you up about what?" "That we've been splitting this evenly." She crossed her arms. I said, "You let the whole family praise you for taking care of Dad. I didn't embarrass you then, but I'm not going to lie to medical staff so you can keep the same story." Dad finally spoke. He said, "She's right." Caroline looked at him. Dad continued, "Emily has done most of it. I should have said that at my birthday." Nobody shouted. Caroline didn't storm out. She just sat there quietly. 2 days later, Dad went home. The first Friday appointment on our new schedule belonged to Caroline. At 8 that morning, she called me because she couldn't find the correct entrance to the clinic. I gave her directions. Then she asked which forms Dad needed. I told her where they were in the folder I had made months earlier. She paused and said, "You really have been doing all of this?" I said, "Yes." It wasn't a dramatic apology, but it was the first honest sentence she had said about the situation. Over the next month, Caroline started taking more of the load. Not half, not perfectly, but enough that I noticed the difference. She stopped posting vague updates online unless she had actually been there. If relatives asked how Dad was doing, she sometimes said, "Emily knows more about that appointment. She's been handling most of the medical stuff." And something else changed in me. I stopped automatically answering every request with yes. If Dad needed something, I helped when I could. If I couldn't, I put it in the group chat instead of silently rearranging my life. At first, that felt selfish. Then it felt normal. A few weeks later, Aunt Marie came by Dad's house while Caroline and I were both there. She mentioned the birthday lunch and said, "Caroline, I hope you're getting some rest after taking care of your dad all year." Caroline looked at me. Then she said, "Actually, Emily carried most of it. I'm only starting to catch up now." Aunt Marie turned to me and said, "I didn't know." I smiled and said, "Most people didn't." That was enough. I never needed a speech in my honor. I didn't need my sister publicly humiliated. I needed the invisible work to stop being treated like it happened by magic. Because when one person in a family always says yes, everyone else can start believing there was never anything to ask. Sometimes the boundary isn't refusing to care. Sometimes it's refusing to care alone.